We've been talking about the near historic snowpack in the Sierra and the big snowmelt underway. Yet some reservoirs are still very low. We're going to be unpacking it all. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods in Northern California, out of the capital city of California. Now, the Department of Water Resources recently increased releases out of Oroville. It's one of our larger reservoirs in the state. It happens to be more in the northern part of the state and feeds into the Feather River. So you can see the huge release coming out of there, that spray of water creating kind of that misty cloud over right off here. To its right, if you're looking at the dam over to the right, that is going to be, this is the spillway. That's going to be the dam right there. And it is the largest in the country. So they got to be very careful on how much water they hold in Oroville. You might remember back in 2017, we had the Oroville spillway situation where part of it collapsed and it caused great concern for downstream residents. All right, let's take a look at Millerton Lake. This is more towards the central and southern part of the state. That looks nearly empty. That came from Valley Dumpster. They were out there, not necessarily for reservoir situation, but they happened to snap these photos where you can see how low everything is, kind of that dry creek bed there with some of the sand starting to show. This is where the water would normally be, and it's incredibly low right now. And the Millerton Lake area is part of that whole conveyance area that has the historic snowpack in parts of the central and southern Sierra. So again, you can see how incredibly low that is. Yet, from Millerton Lake, Bryant Dam is releasing large volumes of water. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation increasing those releases to help manage storage in Millerton Reservoir. Now, you may be thinking, well, why are they releasing that water? There's barely anything in there. Well, it's because of, like I said, that historic snowpack in the Sierra, running at about 235 to over 400% of average, putting our statewide average at over 300% for this point in the year. All of that is eventually going to melt down into the lower elevations, feeding into the rivers, the Kings, the San Joaquin, and many others, Tuolumne, McCollumne. All of that will eventually move in through the Central Valley. And so managing that flow, how much snowpack is coming out, how much the rivers can handle it. And all the rivers are not the same size. So their channel capacity changes when dynamics from area to area. The most vulnerable is going to be the central and southern part of the state. So we'll go over some of these advisories for flooding as well as the watches and warnings that are in place. First of all, we're going to go over the flood warning in effect until 10 a.m. on Wednesday. This is going to be the ongoing flooding issues that we're seeing. And now we've got floodgate releases happening, meaning rivers, creeks, streams, and flood-prone locations will continue to be flooding, and sandbagging operations will continue. Low water crossings also inundated with water and may not be passable. So this is going to be through the central and southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, extending all the way into the Corcoran area. All right, now we move a little bit farther to the north. This is going to be a flood advisory. Again, floodgate releases happening. That's coming out of the Bryant Dam into out of Millerton. And for downstream areas, minor flooding of rivers, streams, and roads possible. The farther you go to the south, the more difficult it is to deal with the flooding. Once we start moving our way up north, we have bigger rivers, and they just can handle bigger flows coming out of those reservoirs. So some areas just aren't managed with big upstream reservoirs, and so everything coming down the hill is basically going to have to settle into the lowest elevations or where it finds capacity to just kind of settle in. That is happening for the Merced River at Pahono Bridge at Yosemite. We've been talking about the closures at the east end for a couple of the campsites. Now, Yosemite is saying until further notice, we're going to close those campsites until Wednesday, but it's very likely going to continue, and we're going to take a look at why. Beautiful waterfalls, by the way, in Yosemite. You can see the huge rush of water coming down the hill, making for a beautiful sight there. But once it gets downstream, the rivers are incredibly high. You can see the tree line right over here and how high that water is coming up. And then when you take a look at some of the campsites, well, this is just one of the structures. There's a fence right there, and how high that water is. We've been hearing from some folks that were saying, yeah, we were out there camping and got out kind of just in time because we could almost see that water starting to come up near the campground. So it's just out of precaution that Yosemite is saying, all right, let's just make sure that people are safe where they're doing some camping so they don't go to sleep overnight. And then suddenly some of our their belongings are basically underwater in some places. So we've got 81 conditions that are normal throughout the state, but 9 above flood stage. We'll zoom in a little bit closer, especially around the Yosemite area and also right along 395 on the West Walker River. Farther up to the north, we've got the Carson River. That's going to be on both the Nevada and California side. That's getting awfully high. And then, of course, we're talking about the Merced River. So we'll look at how those flows kind of ebb and flow throughout the course of the days. You can see how it starts to crest just after the afternoon hours and then start to recede as we head through the morning. And then once the daytime heating affects it again, we start to see those numbers go up back into flood stage. And at Pohono Bridge, this is the one that we've been monitoring, expected to get to that flood stage by late tonight, early tomorrow morning, and then continue to be kind of up and down pattern here, but stay above flood stage for the foreseeable future. So it's one of those situations we're just going to have to monitor continually. Part of this is due to these temperatures throughout the state, well above average. Let's take Sacramento, for example. Our normal high this time of year, 80 degrees. Today, we reached a high of 94. We were 72 for South Lake Tahoe and places like Palm Springs over 100 degrees. Now, it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio. If we get the warm temperatures, then we're automatically going to see the snow melting. There are other factors that come into play, and we're going to take a look at some of those in just a moment, one of which is going to be rain. We had some thunderstorms occurring in through parts of the central and southern Sierra, and it's very likely we'll see that once again for tomorrow. It's appearing more like a summer-like pattern throughout the west with a ridge of high pressure over the desert southwest, the Four Corners. And so with that clockwise circulation, we just kind of take some of that moisture that's occurring right now in Arizona, New Mexico, and pump it up through the Sierra. So our snow melt is still roughly about 6 to 12 inches in about a 3-day period. So cold water and swift currents certainly downstreams, and everybody's being advised not to cross any flooded roadways because the amount of water that are on the roads is not necessarily apparent just from the visuals coming from a vehicle. Always wearing a life jacket as well, and officials are saying even deep into the season, we may be talking about don't even go on those waterways because of how much snow is coming down the hill and will continue to come down the hill. I'll look at that snow comparison in about the past month. And now what I want to point out here is just the color contours that we were looking at just about a month ago. You can see how far it extends kind of up and down the ridge and that Sierra spine going into the lower elevations. Just about a month ago, we actually had snow down to about 3,000 feet. So we were still putting a little bit of fresh powder in places in the Sierra foothills. Now compare that to our current situation, and we've not only lost a lot of that snow water equivalent, but a lot of that is occurring on the lower elevations. The higher snowpack, it's a little bit more difficult to actually melt that down and pull out that snow water equivalent, that water that is held within the snowpack. You can see they're still trying to clear areas in and around the Yosemite area. But when we talk about the snow melt process, this is a little bit of the flood science that goes into it. We'll start off with distribution. It's the path of weather systems that come through during our winter and spring season and how they accumulate, because that has a big those are big factors when we talk about where is the distribution of that snow. Is it in lower elevations? That perhaps is going to melt off a little bit quicker, or is it in the higher elevations? That tends to have a colder temperature profile throughout the course of the spring season. The characteristics of that snow. What's the snow water equivalent? Is it super high where once we start to melt that snow, we're going to get big volumes of water? And what's the temperature of the snowpack? That also plays a big factor, because if that snowpack is super, super cold inside, it's got to get to at least above 32 degrees before it even starts to melt into some of the lower elevation streams, creeks, and rivers. Also, the energy exchange. What are the weather conditions surrounding some of the snowpack? Weather facts, wind, dew point, temperatures. What are the ambient conditions, the atmospheric conditions that are going to be affecting it? And also location. Where does that water go? Is there room for it to be stored in the ground? Is it going to percolate, or is it going to run off? Or does it become jammed with ice? You know, you have those big blocks of ice and then it gets jammed up. That could create a flood as well. So it's a lot of different factors that go into, is it going to be flooding based on the snowpack running off? Let's take a look at when we combine everything that I just talked about, the reservoir storage and the snowpack, and pretty much anywhere you're going to look, it's going to be well above average. This is the western water stored across the western Sierra reservoirs in 28 locations. When we break it down individually for Northern California, running well above average, you can see the orange line right here. We'll look at Central California, same situation, a little bit higher above average. And then the Southern Sierra is just where we have these huge numbers going on. That is why when you saw those pictures of Millerton Lake, it is so very low. They've got to make room for all of this snowpack running down the hill. Our Northern California reservoirs are really looking good, and they're staying super full right now. Shasta is our biggest one, and it's at 98% full. We are coming off of what was near historic low numbers for the Northern California reservoirs. These numbers are looking super healthy right now. Oroville at 96% full. When we take a look at perhaps the central and southern part of the state, that's where these numbers start to drop dramatically. Only 67% full right now for New Melones, 72 for Don Pedro. San Luis, which is shared by both the federal and the state water agencies, is 98% full. And again, that's a great number right there because many people rely on the water coming out of these reservoirs to help them through the dry season. This is where we really get to some stark numbers. Millerton and Pine Flat, where you can see right here, Pine Flat flowing into the Kings River, which has had huge flooding problems with the Tulare Lake Basin, 33% full. And that is, again, because they've got to keep that storage down to make room for the snowpack and the melting that will happen. Now, these are some interesting lines that we've been following. And what I wanted to point out is the 2016-2017 year, we did have flooding downstream. And unfortunately, some of those levees, the earthen levees, did fail. Some of them have been reinforced. But the lines for how the reservoirs have been filling are very similar. Look at how we got to right around that April 1st average. And here we have Lake Shasta filling at almost the same pace. We'll take a look at the Central Sierra at Don Pedro, almost the exact same line here. And you can see how those releases are happening almost in the same fashion. That is true as well for Pine Flat, where we go up, we peak, and then the releases happen. Looks like we'll see another surge potentially coming our way in about the next month or so. What I mean to say here is water managers pretty much know what they're doing. History sometimes does repeat itself. And so all three phases of flooding are happening. Preparedness, response, recovery. Financial help is not only being given right now, but also the agencies are working on finding more financial help for everybody that is affected by the flooding. There's challenges and opportunities with tracking that rapid snowmelt, but also groundwater recharge, which has been one of the hardest hit areas of our water portfolio throughout the state. Under the ridge of high pressure, we're going to see continued warming, the risk of thunderstorms in the Sierra, and very likely more rapid snowmelt happening and flooding concerns growing. Our highs are going to stay in the 90s, well above average, at least for Central California through Monday. A little bit cooler by the following work week.